This was the beginning of a year. Are we coming to the end here? This is the beginning of a year that really changed my life. I mean, it was absolutely remarkable. First of all, to study with Claude Lévi-Strauss in 1960s, when he was writing De Miel en Cendre, or when he was writing Les Bonnes Manières de Table. I think it was Bonnes Manières de Table, the third of his the Cuy series. Man, it was just unbelievable. And to hear the immaculate professionalism of a great mind and a great writer. And that changed my life. Lévi-Strauss was phenomenal. But not only that, there were two other things that occurred that year. One of them was to sit in on the seminars occasionally of Michel Foucault and Roland Barthes. And I have to say, this would make anybody's life, this would change anybody's life, because they were so smart. And not only were they smart, but I'm sure you guys have read Michel Foucault. I mean, you know that the extraordinary thing about reading Michel Foucault is how clear and how clean and how poetic it is as an academic work. And so that was phenomenal to be able to do that. The second thing was to become close with Georges Ballandier. I adored him. He was a great guy and a great thinker, and knew a lot about Africa. And unlike the structuralists, he was very concerned about the political aspects of social life, particularly social life in Africa. I mean, he's the one he said, look, if you're going to study Rwanda, don't study, the mythology of the Tutsi kingdom. Study the protest. Study the reason why it's fragile. Study the reasons why it's unstable. And so it was in the context of Georges Ballandier's seminar that a very strong and fundamental idea came to me, which is that I really need to look at and spend a lot of time thinking about inequalities. And I ended up writing my first book on that. But the third thing, which which made that year extraordinary, this was May 1968, and I became a 68ard. Because, Lévi-Strauss was extraordinary, and Georges Ballandier, and every week his seminars were brilliant. All of a sudden, I began to realize that it was very important to think deeply, not just about Africa with regard to Georges Ballandier, but also about France, and about the stability of contemporary nation states. And it was very clear that after the Fouché reforms at Nanterre, and after the student discontent began in March and April, that something very, very extraordinary was going to happen. And it did. It just was amazing. And I ended up on the barricades, throwing rocks at police, and really getting and being hit by lacrimogène, and really getting a sense of the vulnerability of general people when insouciant political powers and authorities take extreme measures. And I think, and I refer to these two things because this was the final one. The third one is really to be hit by police is a life-changing experience, and I think everybody would agree. And I did get hit on the head a couple times. Tears were flowing from my eyes from tear gas, and I realized that the stupidity of the French, Périfit and the French Minister of Education at the time, I remember, and de Gaulle, I realized that this was not a good situation, and that one should be as aware as possible of what the dynamics were. So that year, actually, this is a wonderful thing to be able to think about it out loud, because that year was extraordinary, because not only did I become interested in anthropology, particularly mainly through Lévi-Strauss and Georges Ballandier, I had a certain perspective, which carried on what I had learned in Johns Hopkins, which was, to be concerned with justice, concerned with inequities, disenfranchisement, and what the consequences were for history and for politics. And then, of course, I had the best practical experience in that you could ever have. And it just so happened that one of my best friends from Johns Hopkins, who has now become a very esteemed professor of technology and science in Canada. Well, the life in Paris was seductive, and I think I wanted then, and I still want to be there. I've gone back at every opportunity. There haven't been as many as I had hoped, but so I stayed I stayed after the book was done, and up until the very end of the summer. But in the course of that summer, in the course of writing the book, something very unpleasant happened. I was drafted into the United States Army, and or at least there was a lottery in those days, and my number was so low, it was inevitable that I was going to be taken into the forces. And there was really only two ways of avoiding it. One was to declare myself gay and inappropriate to be recruited, or go do a PhD program in the United States. And I think that's one of the reasons why so many, active intellectuals of those days ended up taking PhDs, is that everybody, in order to avoid the Vietnam Wars, ended up in school. I've always wondered, that was always been an interesting thing, because you had two choices in those days, do a PhD or go to Canada, or both. And I actually ended up doing both. But so I was very fortunate in that a couple of professors were able to get me into Princeton. It was the first year of Princeton's anthropology program, and so I did escape Vietnam, and I also, though certainly was a very painful process, and escaping it, and I began a PhD in anthropology. Having studied with Lévi-Strauss, it gave me a very fine, and in his seminar, it gave me a very fine recommendation to get into the program. So that's what I did, and was there for a couple of years. As I said before, I was never. It was never my destiny to be an anthropologist. I was just simply following a path that was largely determined, partly by my fascination with structuralism, partly by my interest in justice, but also partly because of the United States political involvement in Vietnam. I mean, that's what drove me into Princeton. And to be perfectly honest, though the profs there were good, and I appreciated them very much, and they were very kind to me. Many of them had been trained at the University of Chicago under Geertz, and it was kind of a branch office of the symbolic school of anthropologists, this rising symbolic school of anthropologists. This is why they took me, because they figured Lévi-Strauss was part of it. So here was this guy who had been in his seminar, and Nur Yalman, Clifford Geertz. And Clifford Geertz had by that time moved to Princeton with his wife, Hildred Geertz. So that's what the department was, in addition to being interested in carrying on the British tradition as well. So and some religious theories of religion. So that became my life for a couple of years. And I have to say that that it was interesting, and it gave me an opportunity to follow what I had done with Ballandier and Lévi-Strauss, but without that. But that's what gave me inspiration, those guys, not what was at Princeton at the time. Though, and I can say a word. I mean, if this opportunity will permit me, I've although it's a bit maybe it's a bit inappropriate because of his stature, but I've always felt that Clifford Geertz was a bit of a sham. He was a marvelous writer, but a very arrogant writer. And after having worked in some of the areas that he's worked in, his writing was so florid, and in a way he was so self-compelled by his own writing that sometimes I just felt it was too much. So I didn't really I didn't really find a great deal of inspiration from the people of that era, and particularly of what Princeton had become, which was, a succursale of Chicago. Though it's a wonderful university and inspirational in so many other departments, that it was great. But during my time there, I did find some authors that I found to be absolutely life-changing, and I don't know why, but and it isn't because I'm a Francophile, because I'm not. But most of them were French. Most of the guys most of the anthropologists or the writers, maybe I call them social scientists, that I really, really was became attached to, and was really inspired by, were French by origin. And I would mention, first of all, because you mentioned you'd like to hear about this, is Louis Dumont. Homo Hierarchicus, I think, was one of the most intelligent books on any subject I have read in a long time, and I've always and I deeply appreciated it. I would mention certainly my reading of Roland Barthes, but for different reasons. Michel Foucault for different reasons mainly, but and then those British anthropologists who had spared themselves, who had defrocked themselves from British anthropology, like Mary Douglas and Edmund Leach. They were great, and so these were the people that. But I have to say that it was through reading Dumont that I began to see how important it was to understand the origins of market economies and the social configurations that they created. So it was from Dumont that I became very, very interested in understanding Marxism. Of course, when you're in Paris and you're in the midst of a revolt, what was if you were going to be, I was sort of part of the Fédération d'étudiants révolutionnaires. These were Maoists, so you read Mao, you read Marx, but because it was fun and it was pertinent. And intellectually, to understand Marx and Rosa Luxemburg and the tradition and Lenin, this was wonderful. And then to bring it back to anthropology, there was Godelier. So while I don't want to say that I was overly influenced by these French anthropologists, they certainly had a major impact on the way I thought. And I was able to maintain my interest in Lévi-Strauss and stayed close to Lévi-Strauss and to be perfectly honest, and what I didn't mention before, while I was in Paris, there was another course being taught in the ambit, if you will, of structuralism by a guy named Luc de Heusch. And I was very fond of Luc de Heusch. Whereas Lévi-Strauss well, a guy like me is not going to talk to Lévi-Strauss every day. You're not going to have an opportunity to have an interpersonal exchange with him. Although I did see him a couple of times in his laboratoire. But Lévi-Strauss was, but Luc de Huyshe was very friendly and was very open. And we had coffee a couple of times. And he said, do be in touch. And he heard that I was trying to write a thesis on Rwanda. And he was really extraordinary. Him was an extraordinary mind. And had been doing stuff, bringing Lévi-Strauss to Africa. And that was a great inspiration for me. So those were the guys who really put my brain together for a while. And I have to say that with Lévi-Strauss, the background, Godelier, Dumont, I was able to bring together the trends, the two separate trends that I had started in Paris, studying with Lévi-Strauss on the one hand and Ballandier on the other, because Luc de Huyshe put them together. He was very sympathetic with Ballandier and with contestation and things like that, and with the tensions in class relations, both in modern economies as well as in traditional economies, and so that's what I ended up doing. I was eager to get through Princeton as quickly as possible. I was kind of eager to get out of the United States. Not really, but it was always in the back of my mind. And so I was able to get a very nice fellowship to do a study of what I had always planned to do, a study of what was going on the fringes of the Rwandan kingdom.